The day the first vision came to Alice Granger, the air smelled of rain that never arrived. She was 7 years old, sitting in the orchard behind her family's farmhouse, when she froze mid-bite into an apple and saw, with terrifying clarity, her father's lantern tipping into a pile of hay. The flames rose so quickly she could feel the heat on her cheeks. The vision lasted only seconds, but when she blinked, the orchard was quiet again. Hours later, her father did exactly as she'd seen, and the barn burned to the ground. In my later interviews with townsfolk, their recollections of that day carried a shared unease, as though the fire had been less a disaster than a revelation. Some swore she'd run to the barn, screaming warnings no child could invent. Others said she stood in the yard watching, pale and silent, as though she had expected it. It was the moment the whispers began, the idea that Alice Granger could see what lay ahead, and that such sight was not a blessing, but a curse. For years, the episodes came without warning, and Alice learned the bitter rhythm of inevitability. A neighbor's horse breaking its leg, a sudden illness in a newborn, a summer storm that flattened half the wheat crop. Each appeared before her eyes days or hours before it happened. Each time she tried to warn someone, each time her warning only seemed to hasten the event or twist it into something worse. By the time she turned 16, she had stopped speaking of her visions entirely, and yet she could not turn them off. The last person she confided in was her mother, who, in a moment of exhausted honesty, told me she had begged Alice to keep quiet. "People don't like to be told their fate," she said, "and they'll like it even less if you're right." It was the truth. The baker's wife crossed herself when Alice entered the shop. Children were pulled indoors as she walked by. Some fathers warned their sons not to look her in the eye. In a town as small as Harrow's End, fear turned quickly to isolation. Then came the vision of the fire. This time it was not a barn or a field. It was her family's own house. She saw the glow before she saw the flames, the front windows turning into molten orange squares, the roof collapsing inward. And in the doorway, the dark shape of a man, motionless, watching the blaze consume everything. The image was so vivid she woke in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her nightdress clinging to her with sweat. She told no one at first, pacing the length of her room as though the floorboards might offer an answer. But the vision returned the next night, and the next, growing sharper with each occurrence. Soon she recognized the man, Everett Miles, a laborer who had once worked for her father but left after a bitter dispute. His narrow shoulders, his lopsided gait, unmistakable. Alice decided she could not let this happen. For days, she followed Everett at a distance, through muddy lanes and across the edge of the mill pond, always just far enough to avoid notice. The more she watched him, the more certain she became that her visions were right. And when she finally confronted him behind the old granary, the words left her lips before she knew she'd spoken them. "I know what you're going to do." Everett stared at her for a long, unreadable moment, then smiled in a way that chilled her more than any vision ever had. But in trying to avert disaster, she unwittingly set in motion the chain of events that brings the vision true. Those words might as well have been carved into the air between them. Everett's smile deepened, not with amusement, but with the slow recognition of someone who has just been handed a secret they can exploit. I've studied many exchanges where a single sentence altered the course of two lives, but this one lingered in my mind as something more corrosive. Witness accounts differ. Some say Everett's eyes narrowed in suspicion, others recall that he stepped toward her, his boots crunching on the frost-laced earth. Alice herself never recorded his exact reply, only the way his expression shifted, the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested an unspoken challenge. From that moment, Everett seemed to appear wherever she went. At the market, she felt his gaze between the barrels of apples. At Sunday service, he lingered by the doorway, letting her pass close enough for their sleeves to brush. It was not overtly threatening, but rather the slow tightening of a noose that made her question whether she had revealed too much. The visions came nightly now, always the same fire, the same still figure in the doorway, the same helpless rage in her chest as she watched. Her attempts to intervene grew subtle. She persuaded her father to repair the roof tiles, claiming she'd noticed a leak. She hid the lantern oil, burying it behind the woodpile. She even convinced her younger brother to sleep in the barn for the adventure, thinking at least one life might be spared if the house burned. Yet each act, instead of easing her dread, seemed to sharpen the inevitability of what she'd seen. One afternoon, she caught Everett speaking with her father outside the general store. Their exchange was brief, but her father's voice carried a tone she recognized, strained courtesy masking distrust. Later, he told her only that Everett had asked after work. "The man's down on his luck," he said, though his eyes betrayed something harder, a shadow of their old quarrel. It was around this time that the townsfolk began to notice changes in Alice. She walked faster, spoke less, her eyes scanning doorways and alleys. Mrs. Carraway, the seamstress, recalled her hands trembling as she paid for a spool of thread. Others remarked on the weight she seemed to carry, though they could not name its source. To me, these were the unmistakable signs of someone wrestling not only with fear, but with the unbearable suspicion that they themselves might be the cause. The night before the fire was due, at least according to the dates Alice had marked in her private journal, she took a final, desperate step. She slipped from her bed under a moonless sky, crept through the orchard, and made her way to Everett's small rented cabin on the edge of town. The air was thick with wood smoke, though no chimney burned nearby. She knocked once, twice. When the door opened, the lamplight behind him cast his face in gold and shadow. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice low but steady. Everett regarded her with that same unreadable half-smile. "And what would that be, Miss Granger?" "That you'll stay away from our house for the next week, for as long as it takes." For a moment, he said nothing, just studied her with the quiet patience of a man watching a trap close. Then, leaning one shoulder against the frame, he answered in a tone that chilled her more than the winter air. "That might depend," he said, "on how badly you want it." The words slid into her like a splinter, lodging somewhere she could neither reach nor ignore. Alice felt the cold bite of the wind then, though it was not the air that chilled her. It was the realization that Everett was no longer just a figure in her visions. He was a man aware of her fear, weighing its value. "I've examined cases where the threat was not a direct promise of harm, but a negotiation of control, and this moment fits the pattern precisely." Everett's posture, his measured tone suggested he was not merely reacting to her plea. He was testing her limits. The fact that she had come to him alone at night gave him an advantage he would not have otherwise possessed. Alice did not answer at once. In the lamplight, she could see the dust on his shirt collar, the faint smear of ash on his cheek. She thought of the fire. How, in her vision, he stood perfectly still in the doorway, not fleeing, not helping. That stillness now seemed intentional, like a man deciding whether to step into the role she had already cast for him. "What do you want?" she asked finally. He shrugged, a slow roll of the shoulders, and leaned closer. "Maybe just a little assurance that when the time comes, you'll remember who you came to for help." She turned and walked away without replying, her boots crunching in the frost, though each step felt as though she were wading deeper into a current she could not fight. That night, the vision came again. But there was a change. This time, when the fire consumed the house, Everett was not in the doorway. Someone else was. Her younger brother, Thomas, his small figure silhouetted by flame. The shift rattled her more than she admitted, even to herself. Had her interference moved the pieces on the board? Was Everett no longer the one who would set the fire, but someone else? Someone closer, someone she might not suspect. Such alterations were rare in her visions, but when they came, they carried the weight of inevitability. I've often wondered whether this was the moment she began to doubt not only her curse, but her own moral standing in trying to change it. The following day, she hovered near Thomas constantly, inventing errands to keep him by her side. Her mother noticed, remarking on her restlessness, but Alice brushed it off. Meanwhile, Everett passed her in the street with a faint nod, as if to remind her the conversation at his cabin had not ended. By evening, Alice resolved on a more drastic measure. If she could keep everyone out of the house that night, perhaps the fire could not take them. She suggested to her father that they all visit her aunt in the next town, citing her mother's wish to see the newborn cousin. Her father refused, muttering about the cold and the cost of travel. When darkness fell, she sat by the front window, watching the road for any sign of Everett or anyone else approaching. Hours passed. The household slept, and then, in the distance, she saw movement, a figure crossing the edge of the orchard, carrying something in one hand. She rose without thinking, heart pounding, and slipped her coat over her nightdress. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she moved to the door, careful not to wake the others. Outside, the air was sharp and clear, the moon spilling silver across the frost. The figure was halfway to the barn when she called out, her voice cutting the stillness. "Everett, what are you doing here?" The name cracked through the night, scattering the quiet like glass. The figure stopped, shoulders stiffening, but did not turn at once. For a moment, Alice thought she had been wrong, that the man before her might be a stranger. Then he pivoted slowly, the moonlight catching the pale edge of his face, and she knew. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he held up what he carried, a small tin pail, its contents hidden in shadow. Her mind raced. Lantern oil, water, something else entirely. In my notes from speaking with surviving townsfolk, opinions diverged. One claimed Everett told her he had come to help with a sick animal. Another swore he had been searching for tools left behind from his work. But Alice, I think, understood the truth before he spoke a word. "Checking on the barn," he said finally, voice low and measured. "Your father's not as careful with the door as he used to be." She stepped closer, unwilling to let distance shield her from the answer she feared. The pail swung lightly from his fingers. "And you needed to do that in the middle of the night?" His gaze shifted past her, toward the dark silhouette of the house. "Some things can't wait until morning." There was a tension in that statement, the kind that coils itself around the listener's thoughts long after it's spoken. In the later hours of that night, I believe Alice replayed those words again and again, wondering whether he had meant the barn, the fire, or something she could not yet name. The vision had never shown her this encounter. That fact alone made her uneasy. It meant she was treading into territory beyond what she had foreseen, altering the current in ways she could not predict. That uncertainty, when a seer no longer knows the shape of what's coming, can be far more dangerous than the curse itself. Everett turned away without another word, vanishing into the barn's shadow. Alice stood in the yard until the cold drove her back inside. She told herself she would keep watch from the window, but sleep took her before she realized it. When morning came, the barn was still standing, the house untouched, yet an unease lingered like smoke that had not yet cleared. Her father mentioned finding the barn door ajar, though nothing was missing. Her mother asked why her boots were muddy. Alice lied, saying she had gone to check the hens. That afternoon, she ventured to the granary, hoping to learn if Everett had been seen elsewhere that night. Mr. Holcomb, the grain merchant, told her he hadn't, but mentioned another detail that sent a chill through her. "Strange thing," he said. "Someone bought a good deal of lamp oil yesterday. Paid in cash, didn't catch who it was." The connection was too easy to make, and yet she knew better than to trust the comfort of certainty. People in Harrow's End were quick to believe the worst when given a shadow to fill with their fears. Still, her thoughts returned to the pail, its unseen contents, and Everett's measured tone. That evening, the vision returned, but with another change. This time, the fire began not in the house, but in the barn. and though the man in the doorway remained obscured, she sensed the watching presence had shifted once again, drawing closer to her family with every alteration. She woke, gasping, her heart pounding with the question she dared not speak aloud. Was she preventing the fire or guiding it to exactly where it wanted to go? That thought did not leave her the next day. It clung to her as she moved through the narrow streets of Harrow's End, following her like an invisible shadow. I've noted in other cases of so-called fated visions that the attempt to alter the outcome often accelerates its arrival. Alice's actions, though seemingly cautious, bore the mark of compulsion. She was not merely reacting to danger, she was shaping it. The more she tried to divert the course of events, the more tightly those events seemed to coil around her. That morning, she made a decision she had resisted for weeks, to confide in someone outside her family. The choice fell on Reverend Hale, not for his kindness, though he had that in abundance, but for his discretion. If anyone could offer a moral anchor in such uncertainty, she believed it was him. In the dim light of the church's back room, she told him everything, the visions since childhood, the accuracy that made others fear her, the fire that shifted in detail each time she intervened. He listened in silence, his hands folded, eyes lowered as if weighing scripture against her words. When she finished, he spoke slowly. "Sometimes, child, the Lord shows us what will be, not so we may stop it, but so we may endure it." The answer felt like a door closing. Alice had hoped for guidance, perhaps even belief in her power to change what was coming. Instead, she heard acceptance of inevitability, a surrender she could not bear. That evening, Everett appeared again, this time in daylight. He stood by the fence while her brother fed the hens, exchanging polite words with Thomas. The sight filled Alice with a sudden, irrational terror. Everett's smile toward the boy was faint, almost fatherly, yet she felt an undercurrent of something else, an acknowledgement that Thomas, too, was a piece on this shifting board. The vision returned that night with ruthless precision. The barn blazed, the air thick with smoke, and this time she saw clearly who was framed in the open doorway. Thomas, his face pale against the firelight, his small hands clenched at his sides. Everett was nowhere in sight. She woke with a cry, certain now that her attempts had displaced the danger entirely. If the fire began in the barn, Thomas would be the one to find it, or be found within it. She could not allow that. The next day, she followed Thomas everywhere, inventing errands and games to keep him inside. Her mother grew irritated, remarking that she was treating him like a lamb in a wolf's den. The phrase lodged itself in Alice's mind, because she knew the wolf was not only Everett, but the fire itself, inevitable and hungry. By nightfall, she had decided on another tactic. She would move all the lanterns, oil and matches from both barn and house, locking them in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. It was a simple safeguard, perhaps futile, but it was something she could do without alerting suspicion. She worked in the cold silence of the cellar, arranging the pails and lamps in a far corner. When she finally climbed back up, brushing dust from her hands, she caught sight of movement through the small kitchen window, a figure crossing the yard. The gate was unfamiliar. Shorter steps, a heavier coat. Not Everett. The figure paused near the barn, as though listening for something, before disappearing inside. Alice stood frozen in the kitchen's dim light, her breath shallow, the chill from the cellar still clinging to her skin. This was not Everett's deliberate stride, nor the careless gait of a stranger. It was purposeful, quick, and heavy, as if every step carried intent. I have often found in testimonies of premonition that the most dangerous moment is not the vision itself, but the gap between recognition and action. Alice, in that gap, felt a peculiar stillness settle over her. She could rush out now, confront the intruder, wake her family. But something held her. It was as though her mind was testing the edges of possibility. If she remained still, would the vision play out differently? After a breathless minute, she chose movement. Pulling her shawl tight, she slipped into the yard, each step careful over the frost-slick ground. The barn loomed darker than the night around it, its boards groaning faintly in the wind. She pressed herself to the side wall, listening. Inside, there was no sound of animals, no rustle of hay, only the faint clink of metal against wood. She stepped to the open doorway. What she saw first was the lantern, one she was certain she had locked away in the root cellar, resting on an overturned crate. The figure crouched beside it, rifling through a small sack. As Alice's eyes adjusted, the intruder's face emerged from shadow. It was not Everett, it was Mr. Holcomb, the grain merchant. The shock was enough to still her tongue. In the interviews I conducted years later, she described feeling as if she had been yanked into a vision without warning, a scene so alien to her expectation that her mind could not immediately place it. Holcomb looked up, startled but not frightened. "Miss Granger," he said, voice low. "Didn't mean to alarm you." She glanced at the lantern, her voice tightening. "That belongs in the house." He nodded, almost sheepishly. "Your father asked me to check for rats. Thought I might need some light." It was a plausible answer, yet her chest constricted with doubt. She had not heard her father mention any such arrangement, and the fact that Holcomb had accessed a lantern she'd hidden hours ago churned her unease into something sharper. When she stepped closer, he straightened, his bulk filling the narrow aisle between stalls. "Best get back inside, miss. Cold out here." There was no threat in his tone, yet the placement of his body between her and the lantern felt deliberate. She retreated, the cold night air biting at her cheeks, and did not turn her back until she was inside the house. That night, the vision came again. But this time, the fire bloomed from two places at once, the barn and the kitchen. Through the smoke, she saw both Everett and Holcomb, not together, but each watching a different blaze as though they were part of the same design. The pattern was unraveling into something wider, more dangerous than she had imagined. If both men were tied to what was coming, then her steps to prevent it might not only be useless, they might be binding the pieces into place. She woke with a decision forming, fragile but clear. She would have to watch them both every hour she could spare, until she understood which man held the match. That resolve carried her through the brittle dawn, when the frost on the window panes caught the first light like fractured glass. In cases of escalating threat, vigilance often becomes its own kind of confinement. Alice learned this quickly. Every trip to the market became an exercise in scanning doorways and corners. She timed her walks so she might pass the grain merchant's shop when Holcomb was unloading sacks, noting the way he lingered near the alley that led to Everett's end of town. She traced Everett's routines too, his visits to the tavern, his odd habit of loitering near the churchyard after dusk. The challenge was in the silences, the hours when neither man could be seen. She imagined them moving beyond her sight, perhaps even together, each action tightening the snare around her family's home. And all the while, the visions came, not nightly now, but unpredictably, like a coin flipped in the dark. Sometimes it was the barn first, sometimes the kitchen, sometimes the entire house alight at once. In every version, she felt the same suffocating heat, the same helplessness. On the fourth day of her surveillance, she followed Holcomb to the edge of the mill pond. He was speaking to a boy no older than 12, pressing something into the child's hand. When the boy left, Alice approached under the pretense of buying grain. Holcomb smiled in that genial, heavy-lidded way of his, but when she mentioned the boy, his eyes sharpened. "Just paying for a delivery," he said. "Nothing to trouble yourself over." The words should have eased her, but they didn't. Instead, she felt the odd certainty that the boy's errand was not meant for daylight work. That evening, she saw Everett outside the tavern, speaking to the very same boy. This time, the boy glanced over his shoulder toward Alice before slipping away into the dark. The connection between the men was no longer a theory. It was a thread, and she could feel it tightening. Her next vision confirmed it. She stood inside the burning kitchen, the smoke curling above her head, and through the haze she saw Everett outside, his back to her, speaking to Holcomb. Neither man moved to help, neither turned toward the flames. They were as fixed in place as figures in a painted scene. When she woke, her pulse still hammered from the heat and the realization. If the two men were working together, her every act of interference might already be known to them. She was not just changing the future, she was giving them her map. That day, she searched the orchard for a place where she could see both the barn and the road. Hidden between two gnarled apple trees, she scraped a shallow hollow in the frozen earth and lined it with an old blanket. From here, she could watch without being seen, could hold vigil against the shape of what was coming. It was during one such vigil that she saw them together for the first time. Everett and Holcomb, standing in the shadow of the barn, speaking too low for her to hear. Everett held a small tin, Holcomb a length of rope. They parted after only a minute, each heading in a different direction, leaving Alice rooted in place with the cold certainty that the fire was no longer a question of if, but when. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and unmovable. She had imagined danger in shadows before, but this was different. This had weight, timing, and intent. In the field of predictive testimony, I've observed that once inevitability is accepted, actions shift from prevention to preparation. Alice's mind seemed to move in that direction now, though she would not yet admit it. She still walked the streets, still watched Everett and Holcomb from concealed corners, but her eyes had begun to measure escape routes, to catalog what could be carried quickly and what would burn first. That night she told her mother she had a headache and excused herself early. Instead of resting, she sat by the small writing desk in her room and began making a list. Lantern oil, gone. Matches, gone. Rope, check. Water pail, ready. Thomas, always within reach. She stopped when she realized she had placed her brother's name in the same column as objects. The thought shamed her, but also clarified something. Her curse was not the visions themselves, but the way they stripped people down to pieces in a sequence of cause and effect. 2 days later, her father mentioned needing to travel to the next town for supplies. He would be gone overnight, leaving only Alice, her mother, and Thomas at home. The words fell into her mind like a match into tinder. Alone in the house, that was when it would happen. She resolved to confront one of them before her father left. Everett was her choice, not because she believed him more likely than Holcomb, but because he had always met her gaze without flinching, as if daring her to see whatever lay behind it. If he was guilty, she thought, she might find it there. She found him behind the tavern, stacking crates. "I saw you with Holcomb," she said without preamble. He didn't look up from his work. "We talk. He sells grain, I haul it sometimes. That's not a crime." "I know what you're planning," she pressed. This time he looked at her, and there was no smile, only a kind of weary amusement. "You think you see everything, don't you?" "I see enough." He leaned on the crate, studying her. "Then you should already know. Whether I do it or not, you'll find a way to make it happen." That answer struck her like a physical blow. It was not a denial, but a reshaping of blame, a reflection she had not wanted to face. She returned home unsettled, her thoughts circling his words until night fell. In her next vision, the fire came faster than before. Sparks blooming into flame almost instantly, the doorway filled not by Everett or Holcomb, but by herself, watching as the house burned behind her. When she woke, the list on her desk felt like an accusation. Preparation was not enough anymore. She would have to choose, to leave before her father's absence or to stay and meet the fire head-on. By morning, her mind was set. If the blaze was coming for her house, she would be inside when it did, not running from it. This was not resignation, it was calculation. The visions had shifted each time she acted, so perhaps the final change would come only if she met it directly, refusing to alter the sequence at all. In the analysis of predictive self-fulfilling events, This is the most dangerous stage, when the subject begins to merge with the inevitability, believing their presence is integral to its outcome. Alice no longer thought in terms of saving the house. She thought in terms of being there when the last image formed. Her father left after midday, the wagon wheels cracking the frozen earth as he guided the horse toward the road. The sound lingered in her ears long after he was gone. Her mother busied herself with mending. Thomas played quietly by the hearth. Alice watched them both, memorizing every movement. It was not sentiment, it was record-keeping, as though her mind were preserving the final hours in their natural state before the fire rewrote them. As darkness approached, she positioned herself by the front door, shawl over her shoulders, a bucket of water within arm's reach. The air outside carried the metallic bite of deep winter, and the sky was a sheet of unbroken black. No stars, no moon. She waited. Minutes slipped into an hour, and still nothing came. Then, faintly, the crunch of boots on snow. Through the gloom, she saw two figures approaching from different angles, one from the orchard, one from the road. Her pulse quickened as she recognized both Everett and Holcomb, their paths converging toward the yard. Neither seemed to notice the other until they were within a dozen paces of the house. "What are you doing here?" she called, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Everett's gaze flicked to Holcomb, then back to her. "Making sure you're safe," he said. Holcomb gave a thin smile. "Just thought I'd check the barn again." The exchange was brittle, each man's words glancing off the other without acknowledgement. Alice felt the air between them charged with unspoken accusation. She realized then that whatever bound these two together was not alliance, but parallel intent, each man moving toward his own end, their collision inevitable. In the vision, she had never seen them this close. The uncertainty of it jolted her, a reminder that she was now in territory with no guide. She stepped forward, placing herself between them and the house. "If either of you means harm here, you'll have to go through me," she said. Everett's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite disdain. "That's the problem, Miss Granger. You're already part of it." Holcomb's eyes narrowed. "Best get inside before you catch your death. Wouldn't want that before the fire comes." The words landed like an open confession, but neither man moved closer. Instead, they turned, each walking back into the dark, leaving her in the yard with her breath clouding the air. Inside, Thomas had fallen asleep by the fire. Alice sank into the chair beside him, feeling the heat on her face and wondering if this warmth was the last she would feel before the blaze. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the night was not over. That knowledge did not come as fear anymore. It was a sensation of waiting, like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, listening for the first crack beneath the ice. She left Thomas sleeping by the hearth and moved through the house in silence, checking every door and shutter. The water bucket was still by the entrance, the rope still coiled in the corner, but these precautions felt absurdly small now, like pebbles placed against a rising tide. In my review of similar accounts, there's often a moment when the subject recognizes their preparations as symbolic rather than practical. Alice seemed to reach that point now. The tools she had gathered were not weapons against the fire, they were talismans against helplessness. The wind picked up after midnight, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Then came the faintest flicker of light through the seam of the front shutters, too steady to be moon or lantern glow. She eased them open just enough to see. Everett stood at the edge of the yard, holding something small in his hands. He was not moving toward the house. He was simply watching, his face unreadable in the glow that came from a single burning match. Alice stepped outside before she could think better of it. "Put it out," she said. He looked down at the match, then back at her. "Why? You've already seen it, haven't you?" Her pulse thundered in her ears. "You don't have to do this." "Maybe I don't," he said, "but neither do you. And yet here we are, both of us waiting for the same thing." The match burned down to his fingers, and he let it fall into the snow where it hissed into nothing. Without another word, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the dark. Alice stood there long after he was gone, her breath rising in pale bursts. She had faced him directly, and still the fire in her vision remained, which meant the spark might come from elsewhere. Inside, she checked the kitchen and froze. One of the lanterns she had locked in the root cellar was sitting on the table, its glass globe smudged with ash. Her mother stood by the pantry, startled by Alice's sudden entrance. "I needed it for the sewing," her mother said, almost defensively. "The light's poor at night." Alice's hands trembled as she reached for the lantern. "Where did you get it?" "The barn," her mother replied. "Mr. Holcomb said it was fine to borrow." The connection slammed into Alice with the force of a blow. Holcomb had been in the barn tonight. Holcomb had sent her mother a lantern she'd hidden to prevent exactly this. She carried the lantern back to the root cellar herself, locking it away again, but the gesture felt hollow. The pieces were already moving, each in its own direction, and she could no longer see how they would come together. Returning upstairs, she glanced at Thomas, still asleep by the fire. The vision came to her then without warning, not in a dream, but in the space between breaths. Flames licking the ceiling, smoke filling her lungs, and in the doorway, a figure she could not see clearly, motionless and watching. And this time, she sensed it was already inside the house. The awareness slid over her skin like a draft through unseen cracks, impossible to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. Every sound became suspect, the faint pop from the cooling hearth, the shift of wood in the frame, even Thomas's soft breathing. In my work, I've documented the phenomenon of anticipatory intrusion, where the subject's mind merges the vision with their immediate surroundings until the two are indistinguishable. Alice was in that state now. She moved slowly through the rooms, holding her breath at each doorway as though she might catch the intruder in mid-motion. The kitchen was empty, the parlor too. When she reached her parents' room, she paused, her hand on the frame. The bed was neatly made, untouched, yet the smell was there. Faint, acrid, like oil that had been heated but not yet burned. She stepped inside. On the dresser sat another lantern, identical to the one she'd locked away twice already. Its wick was clean, unlit, but the glass globe was warm to the touch. Alice's first thought was Holcomb, but the second, colder, was that someone had been in the house while she was awake, moving quietly enough to evade her notice. And if that was true, then the vision's faceless watcher could have been only a few feet away. She carried the lantern to the front door and set it outside in the snow. When she turned back, Thomas was standing in the hallway, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you awake?" he asked. She forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep. Go back to bed." But Thomas lingered. "There was someone in my room." The words froze her in place. "Who?" "I don't know. I thought it was you." Alice crouched to his level. "If you see them again, you come straight to me. Understand?" He nodded, but his eyes were clouded with the same unease she felt in her own chest. The rest of the night passed in a haze of listening, every creak and sigh of the house magnified until she no longer trusted her own hearing. At dawn, she dressed without waking her mother and went straight to the barn. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of oil. A small pile of kindling lay neatly stacked in the center of the floor as though awaiting a spark. She knelt beside it, touching the wood. It was dry, arranged with care. Whoever had placed it here knew what they were doing. From the loft above came a sound, a footstep, deliberate and unhurried. Alice rose slowly, every muscle taut. "Who's there?" she called. Silence. Then another step, closer to the edge. Her heart pounded as she stared into the shadows above. She could see nothing, but she could feel the weight of someone watching her, just as in the vision. And when the voice came, low and measured, it was neither Everett nor Holcomb. "You've been looking in the wrong places, Alice." The words fell from the loft like dust from the rafters, soft but impossible to ignore. She could not place the voice. It was neither Everett's measured cadence nor Holcomb's deep drawl. In later accounts, she would describe the moment as a tearing in the fabric of her understanding. Until now, she had assigned blame like weights on a scale, shifting between two men, believing the danger lived only in one or the other. This voice suggested something far worse, that she had been misled entirely. "Come down," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. A pause, then slow movement. The figure emerged from the shadows, descending the ladder with deliberate care. When his face caught the dim light, Alice's breath caught. It was Reverend Hale. She stepped back instinctively. "You?" He nodded once, without shame. "You told me everything. Your visions, the changes when you interfere. I realized the truth. Your sight isn't a curse. It's a compass. And like any compass, it can be turned." Her pulse quickened. "You've been in the house." His eyes flickered with something between pride and challenge. "Guiding the outcome. Every time you act to prevent the fire, you make new choices, shift the path. I only have to watch where you move next." In my study of manipulative dynamics, this was a perfect example of the predator who reframes the victim's abilities as a shared endeavor, masking control as collaboration. Reverend Hale had positioned himself as an interpreter of her curse, when in truth he was bending it toward his own unseen end. "What do you want?" she demanded. "The same thing you do," he said smoothly. "For the vision to come true. You can't deny it anymore. You've been moving toward it since the first glimpse. The fire is the point, Alice, and you are its keeper." Her mind reeled. The memory of Thomas saying someone had been in his room struck her like a blow. "Stay away from my family." Hale's smile was faint, almost sorrowful. "That's not possible. They're part of the design now, and so are you." He stepped past her, heading toward the barn door. She didn't follow. Her feet were rooted, her mind spiraling through every interaction she'd had with him since confiding in him at the church. He had known the details, had known when her father would be away, and if he had been inside the house once, he could do it again. When she finally moved, it was to run back inside, bolting the doors, checking every lock. Thomas stirred but did not wake as she pulled him closer to her on the hearth rug. Her mother asked no questions, perhaps sensing that whatever had shifted could not be named without breaking it open entirely. Sleep did not come, but the vision did, clearer than ever. The fire roared through both barn and house, the heat a wall that pushed her back. And in the doorway of the burning kitchen stood Reverend Hale, his hands folded as though in prayer, watching her without moving. She woke with the taste of smoke in her mouth and the knowledge that the final moment was coming. It was not fear that anchored her to the bed in those first minutes of consciousness, but a grim clarity. She had no illusions left. There would be no stopping the fire. The only question was whether she could still shape its ending. In post-event analysis, this state is often mistaken for resignation, but it is something more intricate, a tactical acceptance. Alice was no longer fighting the inevitability itself, but the variables inside it. Hale, Everett, Holcomb, each was a moving part in a machine whose outcome she had already seen. By midday, she had packed a small satchel with matches, rope, and a flask of water, not to use against the fire, but to control where it spread. Her logic was as ruthless as it was desperate. If she could direct its path, she might save Thomas, perhaps even her mother. As for herself, she did not plan to leave. That evening, Reverend Hale came to the door. Her mother let him in without hesitation, and Alice felt a strange vertigo watching him stand in their parlor, the very space where her vision placed him in those final seconds. "Your father's return will be delayed," Hale said, his tone calm, almost pastoral. "The roads are worse than expected." It was information only someone watching closely or arranging events would know. Alice kept her distance, leaning against the doorframe, Why are you here?" He met her gaze evenly. "To see if you're ready." She almost laughed at the audacity of it. "For the fire. For the choice," he said, and in that moment she realized he did not see himself as the fire's cause, but as its steward, just as he imagined her to be. After he left, she lit no lamps, keeping the house in darkness. She told Thomas to sleep in her room and locked the door. Her mother did not question it, perhaps sensing the current beneath the calm. Near midnight, the first scent of smoke reached her, not from outside, but from the floorboards below. The vision had begun to unspool in reality. She woke Thomas, pressing a finger to her lips, and guided him toward the back door. Through the crack, she saw light flaring in the barn, the shadows of two figures moving within. Too far to name, but she knew one was Hale. The second, she suspected, was Everett. She pushed Thomas into the orchard, whispering for him to run to the neighboring farm. "Don't look back," she told him, though she knew he would. Inside, the smoke thickened. She moved through it as though retracing steps from a memory, the heat on her face almost familiar. In the kitchen, she saw him, Hale, exactly as in the vision, hands folded, eyes fixed on her. This time, she walked straight toward him. "If it's going to happen," she said, "then it happens with me watching you." He smiled faintly, stepping aside to let the flames fill the doorway. And in that instant, she understood there was still one thing she could change. The visions had always shown her as a passive figure, watching, unable to alter the scene. But here, in the heat and roar of it, she realized she was not bound to stand still. Her gaze darted to the pail of oil near the hearth, the one she had not moved because in every vision it had been irrelevant. If she shifted it now, if she redirected the flames, she could push the fire toward one side of the house and away from the other. It was a choice with no guarantee, but it was hers. In post-event reconstructions, such moments are rare. A subject caught in the jaws of inevitability will often cling to the exact path foreseen, fearing deviation might worsen the end. Alice broke that rule. She seized the pail, flinging it toward the already burning drapery near the front windows. The blaze leapt hungrily in that direction, pulling heat and smoke with it. Hale's eyes followed the motion, and for the first time she saw surprise break his composure. "What are you doing?" "Changing it," she said, and moved toward the kitchen door that led to the back. Through the smoke, she saw a movement. Holcomb, his coat sleeve aflame, stumbling from the barn toward the yard. Behind him, Everett was shouting something she couldn't hear over the fire's roar. Whether they had come as allies or rivals no longer mattered. The flames were swallowing everything between them. She reached the back door and found Thomas there, wide-eyed and coughing, defying her instructions to run. He had come back for her. Grabbing his arm, she pulled him toward the orchard. The wind shifted then, sending a wave of sparks over the roof. The heat was blinding, but the fire's center of gravity had moved. Most of the house was still intact. It might hold long enough for help to come. Behind them, Hale's voice rose over the crackle. "You can't change the ending, Alice. It will find you." She didn't look back. They reached the far side of the orchard, collapsing against the frozen ground. The house was a half-lit skeleton, flames licking only its front rooms. The barn was gone entirely. In later interviews, a neighbor claimed he saw Hale walking away from the blaze, untouched by the smoke, his expression unreadable. Everett and Holcomb were found nearby, both injured, neither willing to speak of the other's role. For Alice, the fire was both what she had foreseen and something entirely new. The structure still stood. Her family lived. Yet the vision's watcher had been real, and he had walked away into the dark. As dawn crept over Harrow's End, she stood in the frost, Thomas at her side, and felt the weight of an unasked question pressing against her. Had she ended the curse tonight, or simply changed the shape of its next beginning? The question trailed her through the pale hours after dawn, when the frost began to melt and the acrid scent of smoke still clung to her skin. The fire was out, the danger past for now, but the absence of flames did not feel like victory. In my concluding review of the case, it is clear that Alice Granger's survival was not the end of her story. The vision had fractured into pieces, some fulfilled, others altered beyond recognition, yet the thread connecting them remained taut. She had learned, perhaps too late, that inevitability is not destroyed by deviation. It is merely redirected. The townsfolk gathered by mid-morning, murmuring in tight clusters. Some marveled that the house still stood, others muttered about divine mercy. But a few, those who had always feared her, looked at Alice with renewed suspicion. The fire had not taken her, and to them, that was its own kind of omen. Reverend Hale was gone. No one saw him leave, and no one could say where he'd gone. Everett and Holcomb were taken in by the constable, but released within days for lack of proof. Their burns would heal, their silence remained unbroken. For Alice, the true wound was the knowledge that the watcher in her visions had been real, and that he had stepped away from the blaze untouched. She could feel that absence like a presence, the way one senses a storm has passed only to find the air heavier than before. That night she walked alone to the orchard, the same path she had taken so many times before in search of signs. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the scorched edge of the barn. There, between the apple trees, she thought she saw movement, a figure standing just beyond the frost line, hands folded in quiet patience. She did not move closer. She did not call out. Whether it was Hale or some remnant of the curse-given shape, she could not say. The figure remained still until a thin veil of fog drifted in, swallowing it whole. When she returned to the house, she found Thomas asleep, her mother dozing in the chair beside him. She sat at the hearth, staring into the embers, and let herself feel the truth she had avoided. Her visions would return. Whether they showed fire or something else entirely, they would come, and she would again stand at the fault line between prevention and surrender. In the years that followed, the Granger home became a quiet landmark. Some came to see the scorched timbers that had somehow held against the blaze. Others came for the whispers that in the early morning fog you could see a girl watching from the edge of the orchard, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. And so, the story of Alice Granger remains, a tale of foresight, fate, and the thin line between shaping the future and being shaped by it. Perhaps her final act was an ending. Perhaps it was only the first turn of a larger wheel. What do you believe? Was the curse broken that night, or merely passed on to the next shadow in the fog? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories where truth and dread walk hand in hand. Because sometimes what we see coming is not the danger itself, but the door that leads us to it.